move on to questions. So starting with Nick Baumann, who's the senior enterprise editor at HuffPost, then Erik Vance, who's a science writer and editor, and also a wrangler, a former porcupine wrangler, as we learned last night. Next is Mark Silver, the editor of the Goats and Soda blog at NPR. Stacey Samuels, supervising editor at Weekend Edition.
No, for NPR.
Oh, for NPR.
Yes.
Excuse me. Dan Ephron, who's the executive editor for News at Foreign Policy. Yolanda Lopez, director of news for VOA. And Dayna Myers, who is the managing editor of Global Health Now. So, Nick?
Hi, my name is Nick Baumann. I'm an editor at HuffPost, which is probably heard of, but is an international news site, and we do a lot of political news and have international editions all over the world. I get a lot of pitches. I don't get enough really good pitches. And I just wanted to give you 3 quick tips. The first is when you're pitching, remember if you're pitching cold, I probably haven't seen your writing before. So I'm going to be judging your writing skills, your reporting skills, and your understanding of your story from your pitch. And especially because I get a lot of pitches, I might not have time to read through your best clips or whatever. You know, first impression really matters. If your pitch is disorganized or poorly written, I'm going to be less likely to buy it from you. The second tip is to remember that you're selling something. People tend to forget this, but like the reaction you're trying to get from an editor is, I want to pay this person money to find out what the final version of this story looks like. And so that's a really important thing to remember, and in the same sense that, you know, when you have a great lead or a great nut graph to a story, you're trying to convince the reader to keep reading. You want to be able to convince that editor, hey, I want to pay this person money. One tip I give people about that bit is to imagine that you're walking down a hall with a colleague and you're talking about the story. And the reaction you want to get is someone is passing you in the hallway and they hear you talking about it and they're like, oh man, I want to hear more about that. The third thing I want to remind you about is that there's a difference between a topic and a story. A lot of the pitches we get are very general topics. The difference between a story and a topic in a very easy way to remember is that a story has characters and plot. So, you know, much like, you know, if you're writing a fiction story, you know, I want to know who you're going to be talking to, who the central character in the piece is, and then what they do. If I don't see that, I'm much less likely to buy your pitch. I'm really looking forward to answering your questions and also to getting pitches from some of you. Thanks.
Okay, should I stay on this time? My name is Erik Vance. I'm the person who pitches many of the people on this panel, or people like this. And I, as a freelancer, pitching is sort of my whole life. In fact, I often say that I'm better at pitching than I am at writing, which is very disappointing for a lot of my editors, actually. This was a really great pitch. The story kind of sucks, but it's a great pitch. Which, if you got to choose, honestly, is the way you want to be, because that's how we make our money, you know. And one of these days, I will learn to write better. But like that is how we make our money. This is what we do. This is like almost our job. And to do that, you actually have to understand the media environment as well as you understand your topic. So when you think about like, you know, oh, I write about macaques and and climate change or something like that. Like, you might know that topic really well, but you actually have to know which magazines or outlets do what even better. So it's like, oh, I've got this great profile that I want to pitch Harper's Magazine. Well, you better know that Harper's doesn't do profiles unless they are nuts, and you're basically going to insult them by giving them something that is not what they do, and it's going to show that you don't read the magazine. And no one knows this better than me, because I've done this. My very first pitch, before I had gone to journalism school or done anything, I just wanted to write, and I pitched this story to Christian Science Monitor about marshes in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'd been working the marshes, and I was all about it. And they said, yeah, okay, that sounds like an interesting idea. Why don't you send us a formal pitch with just the first couple sentences how you do it? And I pitched them this sort of introspective, first-person account of seeing a marsh for the first time and how it made me feel, which is the worst thing you could pitch a newspaper. That wants a normal lead, and the guy basically wrote back and said, "You obviously have never read our paper. Don't ever pitch us again. Go away." And rightly so. It was terrible. And I ended up, going. That's why I went through grad school. And these are the things that, the mistakes I had to learn. But you need to know what people are looking for, not just what they do, but what they think they do. How do they see themselves? How does a magazine? What is Wired? How do they describe themselves? It's a very specific thing, and you have to know that. So that's the difference between really being able to get in that door, and then once you get there, once you're able to do that, then people will give you leeway and say, well, this pitch you sent us was kind of half thought out and it wasn't really great, but we know you do good work, so let's talk about it and we'll figure out how we can make this something that we want. But those first pitches, basically, and I think Nick was sort of alluding to this, they're looking for reasons to say no. No, what's the thing that's going to allow me to say no? And the only thing that's going to make them say yes is if you can get to the point where they're reading it and saying, oh man, this is so us, we have to take this. This is such a Wired story. This is more Wired than Wired. We have to take this story. Otherwise, he's going to give it to someone else, and this is everyone's going to want to. That's the level you have to kind of get at. Or National Geographic, you basically have to pitch something that involves a photo that's never been taken before, which you have to think about that. You pitch National Geographic, don't pitch them something that's going to only take place in laboratories. And you may see those stories in the magazine, but those are people who've written for them before and who were able to cultivate that. That wasn't, you won't see that if you have this laboratory story that maybe could be very interesting as some photos if you got just the right photographer. Well, that wasn't that person's first pitch. Their first pitch was going to be a classic National Geographic story, and you have to know what that looks like. A classic, the classic New Yorker story. What does that look like? And you have to know that down to your bones, because the editors are going to very quickly be able to tell, and they're looking to say no. They want to say no. So you have to force them to say yes, because it's just so them. I think on the flip side of my horrible Christian Science Monitor experience, the very first thing I ever, can I curse? Is that okay? To curse?
No, you're live stream.
I'm live streaming. Okay. I sent a pitch to Mental Floss magazine, and it was odd and it was strange, and I also had the thing about me being chasing porcupines in my sort of CV in a weird place, because I know Mental Floss considers themselves to be odd, and they like the errata of life, and they're sort of they like that sort of eye-catching stuff. And the editor wrote back to me with basically a profanity-laced email, who are you? What is this? And then they're like, yeah, let's talk more about the story you want to do, because you're weird. And I knew that that's what they wanted. Now you won't send that to the New Yorker, because they're gonna laugh in your face. They won't even bother laughing in your face. They'll just ignore it. So that's the thing. You have to understand the environment. You have to get to know, and you have to love these places you write for. So that's my advice.
Hi, I'm Mark Silver from NPR, where I edit the Goats and Soda blog, and I'll tell you why I got that name afterwards. Erik, I want to say yes all the time.
Oh,
really? But all the pitches keep me from saying yes. We publish about a dozen stories a week. We cover global health and development. Our tagline is Tales of Life in a Changing World, so we try to be as open to just an interesting story about something happening in one of the low and middle income countries in the world that we focus on. I used to work at National Geographic, and my editor there would, whenever a pitch came in, she would reference this TV show that you probably never heard of called Naked City that was on in the 50s. And the tagline was, there are 8 million stories in the Naked City. And my editor would scale it down. She said, there's 1 million stories in the Naked City. Why should we do this one, and why should we do it now? And to me, that's the essence of the pitch. I want to know, why should I do this story? There's there's thousands of stories about female genital mutilation that we could cover. Why this one, and why now? And you really need to do your homework. I just got a pitch for a great story about a program teaching teenage girls in Lagos to become auto mechanics. I was like, wow, that is such a cool story. And then I just Googled it, and NPR did that story 4 years ago. So please do your homework. It's like, don't make me Google to see if your story has been done not only by other outlets, but by me as well. Keep it really short. I get like 200 emails a day. I can't read a 600-word pitch. I want 2 paragraphs, kind of like the passing in the hallway or the elevator pitch. I used to say to writers, please don't harangue me, but now I get so many emails I often lose track of or forget about a pitch, especially if it comes in on a Friday. So I think it's okay to gently remind an editor a week later, and I don't mind that, but I don't like getting threatened. Some people will say, if you can't respond to this pitch by today, I'm taking it elsewhere. And then I always go like, go ahead. And then they're like, oh no, I didn't mean that. So I understand there's some pitches that are really newsy and timely, and if you're pitching something off the bombings in the US right now, of course, I need to respond to that, but don't add pressure to my already pressured life. I think getting no, actually, as a sometime freelancer, I love getting a no, because a no is an answer, and you're done, and I can be, okay, they don't want me, I'm gonna move on. But sometimes you can come back and reassert yourself, and that's okay. I want a writer who really believes in that story and is passionate about it, and I've sometimes said to somebody, I'm gonna pass on that story, and they'll say to me, you really shouldn't, and here's why. And it brought back an experience I had where I wrote a book a few years ago, and it was rejected by, I don't know, a dozen publishers. It was a book for husbands of breast cancer patients, and every publisher was, oh, guys don't read self-help books. And finally one publisher was like, well, maybe do a sample chapter, and I did a sample chapter, and they said no. But then I had that sample chapter and took her to another publisher who finally said yes. So it's okay to persist, just don't over-persist, I guess. And again, be grateful for a no, but hope for a yes.
Hi, I'm Stacey Samuel. I'm a supervising editor at NPR. I work on the news desk, so I have the unique sort of position of knowing, colleagues on different desks like Mark and on, you name the beat. And having come from television and documentary before, my life is just filled with pitches, either being pitched, and most of them I will tell you are terrible, unfortunately. But when you get great pitches, and by the way, I also pitch all the time, not just shaping stories as an editor now, but I'm constantly pitching, because when I get a great pitch, I then have to pitch it to my colleagues. I gotta convince them that it's worthy of going on the air or being on their blogs and their sites. So, I sat down with one of our colleagues and I said, you get a lot of the outside pitches. I deal with a lot of the correspondents and the freelancers who are kind of already in our pool and, and help refine their pitches. So I've got a relationship. And he said, Stace, the thing that's most important when people are pitching is build a relationship with the editors that you most want to work with, right? Or work for. And it starts small. I mean, many of you have so many wonderful ideas and you may have access, but offering a pitch like to go to Ukraine right now, and this person doesn't know you, well, I'm afraid I don't know you. I don't know what you can deliver. And remember, in your pitches, you gotta tell me that you can deliver it and tell me how. But some parts of the world are really, they're very unsafe, right? And I don't have to tell you any more than that, right? We know that this is a reality. So if you are building a relationship, know that if you want to go to some place that is very dangerous in the world, that if it's a first-time pitch, you're not likely to get it. You're just not, because it's a major liability for networks, right? So scale it down. Start small when you're building a relationship. Let your editor know, here's what I've got for you. You've done all the things my colleagues have said, and you're going to hear more, right? You know your story is not just a broad topic. You've done some reporting. You've given us the cocktail party information, right? That walking down the hall, here's the most important thing, or I'm at a cocktail party, this is the most important or interesting thing about it. So you've done that already. You've teased that out of your story. But then you want to make sure that it's doable. You want to make sure you tell us, listen, I already have a sense of the time frame that it's going to take. I can deliver it around by this time, because these are the things that are important to us. Because I have holes to fill, right? That's what I do. I have to fill these holes for help a morning edition fill a hole. Newscast is looking for spots. You know, digital could really use these kinds of stories, right? So build your relationships. You know, again, don't ever threaten someone. You know, I've gotten that. I've actually gotten well, fine, I'll take it elsewhere. Please be my guest. I've got 15 others that I got to read that are good too, you know. But the other thing is, little things mean a lot. Don't misspell someone's name. It's going to sound crazy. My name is Stacy with an EY. When people send me a pitch with a Y, I'm like, you know, they didn't pay attention. You know, something silly like that will catch my eye, right? And kind of can turn me off. Some basic things. Make sure you get their titles right, you know. You want to know that, and again, you're going to demonstrate that you know that publication or that news organization's work, because you can reference something. You know, like Mark said, when you did that story 4 years ago, it was fantastic. Here's what's new. Here's what I bring, and you all have unique voices, right? You know, some of you are going to have different levels of access by way of, like, you know, family relationships or culture or language. Bring that in. Tell us why you can do that story really well. Why you and not someone else, as well as why now, and why again if we did it 4 years ago. What's new? What are we missing? So those are some of the things, and I'm happy to talk more about how then to shape a pitch.
Hi, everyone. I am Dan Ephron. I'm the executive editor for News and Foreign Policy, which means I run a news team of about 8 people at the magazine, and I get pitches all the time. I was a writer and reporter for my entire career. I never thought I'd be an editor, and 6 months ago I took this job. This is my first job as an editor. I have pitched profiles to Harper's Magazine and gotten the rejection slips. And often I feel like in the meetings, in the news meetings, I'm the insurgent in the room. I'm the infiltrator in the room, the reporter who is sitting among editors and thinking still as a reporter. Here's some things that have changed in my mind. I have come to understand something about reporting versus editing. When you're a reporter, you get to be focused. One story, one beat, one region that you're doing. When you're an editor, you're focused on 7 different things, 8 different things, the stories of each of your reporters, the meetings, the managing, the drama inside the newsroom. It's not harder. I think reporting and writing is harder than editing, but it's more dispersed. And it's much harder for me to focus. I am a great emailer. I respond usually right away, often within an hour. I have found as an editor that sometimes I don't respond to people. Not usually. Usually I do, but occasionally an email comes in and it falls off. And I have noticed the pattern is that when the email isn't direct, when it doesn't get right to the point, in a way where I can take it in, I can ingest it, and then respond, it lingers, and then sometimes it falls off. So what does direct mean? I'm going to be very practical. Your pitches should tell me what you're going to tell me in your story, how you're going to tell me what you're going to tell me. This sounds a little bit like Donald Rumsfeld. What you're going to tell me, how you're going to tell me, and then why you're going to tell me. Another way of saying that is, what's your story? How are you going to go about telling me that story? And then why it's important. And I need all that in the first paragraph. I need to be able to take all that in one paragraph. Some pitches are long. Sometimes people are pitching stories to me that are 3 or 4 or 5,000 words long. It's okay to send me a long pitch, but I need to take in that first paragraph all of that information. Then you can back up and tell me the story from the beginning to the end. I'm going to read a pitch that I wrote a year ago for the Washington Post. It was for a very long story, a 6,000-word story, and it was about Israel, the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War. And it's a long pitch. I'm only going to read the first paragraph or two. It starts with, "Hi, honey." But the honey is not the editor, the honey is my wife. I actually say, "I know you're exhausted, honey, but can we find time to discuss this pitch tonight, or maybe tomorrow morning?" I'm including that, I'm reading that to you because it's also useful once you have the pitch, run it by somebody. who doesn't know the story and who is going to be like your editor, taking it in cold. So here is the pitch. And I had lunch with an editor. I described it in the meeting, and then I wrote a follow-up. And I wrote, the idea is to spend 1 to 2 weeks staying with Israeli settlers across the West Bank in their homes through Airbnb, and then to write a piece that gets at how normalized life has become for settlers, how the settlements themselves have become so tightly woven into the fabric of Israeli society that 50 years after the Six-Day War, the possibility of dismantling them and trading the territory for peace with the Palestinians is no longer imaginable. The big idea I'd aim to convey: a short war between Israelis, between Israel and the Arabs in 1967, triggered a much longer war among Israelis themselves. A half-century later, settlers and their supporters have emerged as the victors. So what is my story? I am telling them my story is how the settlements themselves have become so tightly woven into the fabric of Israeli society, and what that means for the prospect of peace, for the prospect of trading those territories for peace with the Palestinians. How am I going to tell that story? I'm going to go into people's homes. I'm going to book a room on Airbnb, and I'm going to be in their homes, and they have to talk to me by virtue of me being there. And then why does it matter? The last line there: a very short war, 6 days, 50 years ago, gave way to a 50-year war internally, and now we're starting to see the signs of an end to that war and a victor, the Israeli right and the settlers. All that is in one paragraph. I go on to write how I'm going to do it and who I'm going to speak to and who the characters are. But already as an editor, I can take that in and know what I'm going to get from the writer.
Hello, my name is Yolanda Lopez. I'm the director of the News Center at Voice of America. Voice of America, probably you are not very familiar with it because we broadcast to the rest of the world. That is our mandate. So we broadcast and we produce content for an international audience exclusively. And that means that all the pitches, besides everything that you have heard in here that I can't, obviously everything applies for Voice of America, but also I would say that all the pitches have to have, in my case, I'm looking for a broader appeal. And you cannot come to me with a pitch that is too local or that is too domestic. And also it is important, especially when you are targeting an international audience, to put context into it, because there is a lot of things, a lot of even terms, even me that I'm from another country, there are some anachronisms that I don't understand what they mean. So you have to be mindful of the audience and be and think about what is the kind of language and context you are going to put in your story, so somebody in Vietnam is going to understand, somebody in Afghanistan is going to understand. So that is very, including the language that you are going to use, that is very important. So to me, we do a lot of, we have websites, we do also a lot of the radio and a lot of the TV. Since we want to explain America to the world and American policies and how we live, how we go about in our everyday lives. And to us, it's very important to have personal touch in the story, a main character to the story, and to find through this character to tell a bigger story. If you go about too generic or just interviewing think tank people and with these big words and big ideas, it is difficult to engage people, especially if it is not your language, English is not your language. So it is very important for us to go small, and from small go bigger. And also another important tip that I find is, especially when there is breaking news, but you want to pitch something about that big news that is obviously is going to be told to death, or like the bombs or the shootings. What is it that you can pitch that is totally different, a story as a good sidebar that is going to help the editors get some added value to that story? For instance, a few weeks back, it was the 1-year anniversary of Las Vegas shooting. So we did a story about someone that survived, and 1 year later, the same weekend, she was getting married. So so we, with that story, we don't, we go through her journey through the year and then preparing for her wedding, but the shooting is in the back in everybody's mind. But we are not going about with the shooting. We are not starting with that. It's something larger, it's something smaller. And the important thing in here is the personal story, those nuances of the people that, in this case, survive a tragedy like that, and how they go on with their lives. And now 1 year later, they're planning their wedding and they're getting married. So that's something totally unique, different, and we are telling the story, but it's different. So I have more examples, and I hope we can have time to work and to talk about more of those samples in this session.
So I work for Global Health Now, which is it's an e-newsletter that comes out under the umbrella of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And so we're looking for stories all the time that are not, that either they haven't been reported or the mainstream media is not seeing all the angles that maybe people who are in the field or doing work in this certain area can understand. And so we're always trying to sift through the things that we get in pitches that might be more promotional or self-promotional. And I would say boring is your enemy. You want to catch us right in the beginning, and we are looking for something that gives us a little bit of the chills. There's something different about it that it really stands out. And one example of a dream pitch for us was back when we first started doing a contest for Untold Stories, and we received a pitch, and it could have started out, mycetoma is a horrible neglected disease and a lot of people are dying and we should do more to raise awareness about it. But this person submitted an idea that was just, it made us all step back and take notice, because she said, I went to the briefing at the World Health Assembly, and the delegates there were going to different briefing rooms, and they had this group that cared about mycetoma in Sudan had prepared briefing packets in the room. Every chair had the packet, and it was perfectly, carefully prepared. And they sat down to begin their talk, and nobody came. None of the delegates there came. So she started off right away by showing us this is an important disease, and it's something.
Can you step forward a little? Step up to here. Yeah, I think it's the speaker.
Oh, there's a mic button.
Oh, there is.
Oh, okay. I'll come over here.
Yeah, that's fine.
So anyway, and then, we always say in our contest too, we're looking for specific, we're looking for someone who has contacts, someone who has, specific details, something that tells us why they should tell the story. And sometimes, as in this case, it turned out that she didn't have data, but that turned out to be part of the story. The story was that this disease was so neglected that it wasn't getting the research dollars, the funding to make that happen. And so as a result of this story, it helped add to momentum to get this added to the WHO's list of neglected diseases. So that's an example of a dream pitch for us. Then there are nightmare pitches, and some of the threads of a nightmare pitch might be, it looks too much like a PR release, and we're really looking for things that aren't self-promotional. You might have a charity that you've worked with, and it's a really important, wonderful story, and they're doing good work, but that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for something that's newsy, and so we want to sift through that. So don't present, you need to have it up at the top. It needs to be, not waiting until the end to tell us who you are and that you're a journalist and that you have experience or expertise in a certain region or area. Put that in the beginning if we don't know you, so that we understand what you can bring. And that's so valuable for a small news outlet like us, because we don't have bureaus overseas in different places. So we're looking for people who already know a different region and who can bring that. So tell us that up front and explain why you can bring something different to the story. And just to say too, then there's the recurring nightmare where sometimes people are upset that we didn't take their pitch, and rejected the reasons why we couldn't publish it, and so don't send angry, hostile responses back, because it could also be that maybe we thought you had some interesting ideas, but we don't have the bandwidth to take that on now, but we've put you on a list of people, oh, that person has expertise in Nepal, someday we might want to do something. And so don't give up, take the rejection in stride, keep the relationship, send us updates. If you notice something in our article that maybe there's a gap on a story, tell us. We want to hear from you, and then that tells us that you're paying attention to the types of things we're looking for, and we'll be more likely to listen to your stories. And we're also happy if you reach out to us and you want to have a meeting or talk about the types of reporting you want to do. We're very open to talking to people. We just are small, and we might not be able to take your idea right away, so keep that in mind. And the other thing, too, I wanted to give an example of from my own work experience when I worked in a newsroom, and I was constantly trying to get us to cover more international stories, and so the opposite was our audience was more domestic, and I had an editor who would say, well, okay, a ferry sinking, how many people died? 70? No. And it seemed ruthless and heartless, but really it wasn't that he was unenlightened. I needed to craft that better. I needed to make it interesting to him and see how there might be connections to the American audience, to see if that's what it takes, to sell my idea more. And so not to just think, well, that person, editors can be ruthless, but they usually also are just pushing you to try and present your idea in a way that it's going to tie into what their goals are and what their coverage is.
Thank you. So I have a question about pitching multiple stories at once. So is that does that make you nervous? Do you prefer it when people send you just one pitch at a time? How do you feel about that? This is directed to anybody on the panel who wants to answer.
In my experience, for your first pitch to an outlet, it needs to be crafted for that outlet, and it's like your best one for them. Once you get to know them, chances are many editors will say, look, just send me 5 of your best ideas you're playing with right now, and they can be really soft, and if you're not really sure how they fit together, like we'll talk about it, and let me just pick one, because we know you can deliver. Now send us a bunch. But I think that first time, if you send 5 pitches, you're going to get 5 pitches that aren't read. If you send one, and it's just for that magazine, it's perfect, you're much more likely to get it read.
Yeah, I would agree, except sometimes someone will pitch me and say, I'm traveling to South Sudan or wherever, and there's 3 stories I'm interested in, and in that circumstance, I think I'm willing to look at a couple ideas and see if one of them would work first. But in general, I agree. I think one pitch to say no to.
Yeah, I will agree that when travel money is involved and you are going to invest in a trip, probably you want to have more than one story from that reporter.
That sort of gets at the, a lot of people talked about the why you element of pitching. A lot of times if you're pitching me, I'm looking for, do you have special access of some kind, i.e. are you going on a trip to South Sudan or wherever? Or do you have reporting that is going to be really hard for someone else to replicate? You have access to a bunch of documents that no one else has, or you've gotten cooperation from a source that no one else has cooperation from. That sort of exclusivity is really going to make a pitch stand out, especially because I have staff reporters, right? So I have a team of people who are on staff. So if it's something that it's easy for us to do on staff, we're much less likely to pay someone who's not on staff to do it.
And do you have any guidance for pitching the story before you've done the reporting? Before you've gone into the field? So for students who haven't traveled yet, for instance, but who, they've done their pre-reporting, they've planned their trip, but they haven't been there yet, so they don't know if things are going to pan out in the way that they expect them to.
Yeah, the rule of thumb for me is when I was pitching was I try to have 20%. 20% of the story locked up, which means that at the very least I know what I'm going to say, I know who I'm going to talk to. But then, part of reporting, and maybe this is the big difference between reporting and opining, or reporting and opinion writing, is that an opinion writer, when he sits down at the table, he knows what he's going to say. A reporter, when he's embarking, or she's embarking on the trip, you sort of want to be open in your heart to anything happening. So you spell out the story based on some amount of the reporting. If it's in a region that you're going to, you have to do it online or you have to do it by phone. But you take into account that the story might evolve as you're talking to people.
Yes, in that I would like to emphasize, because that's something that we talk about in the newsroom. Even when you do a good pitch, when you are outside, allow yourself to be surprised. If you are with the story already written, then you are going to miss out something when you do the actual reporting. So you have to be open-minded. So the pitch is important. You have to do your homework and you have to have some basis. But allow yourself to be surprised. So maybe the story won't pan out the way you want it, but probably it's going to be better because you have something new that you didn't expect it. And unexpected and surprise are things that I like.
And I would add to that, that's especially true when you're on a beat for a long time, and you reflexively come to know the issues. And even before you sit down with the person you're interviewing, you know what they're going to say. I remember consciously driving to interviews and saying, I'm going to forget everything I know. I'm going to try not to anticipate what they say. I'm going to be open in my heart to understanding something new about this person or about this situation. And it makes the story better, and it makes our jobs funner and more interesting.
But to your point, because so many of the fellows are new to this, I would suggest that they do as much reporting before and to certainly try to pitch it before. Because once they've already gotten out into the field and they bring it to me or to any of us and we say, oh, but what about this element? Here's a thread we're particularly interested in because they don't have the benefit of what we're talking about in our newsrooms and what trends we may be seeing, and they've already gone and done the work, but they don't have this part that we would be interested in. So I think, there's a better shot at, if I know someone's already out there, I know that person can go and do that and et cetera. So I would lean towards pitch it first. Try to do it on spec before you leave.
And I love it if there's a little bit of reporting in the pitch. I mean, I think it's really critical. I used to work at US News. We would say that the pitches were often better written than the stories because the writer would talk to a couple key experts and develop a thesis for the story and kind of boil it down to two really smartly written graphs, and that's very helpful. I've also had, I know reporting changes as you get out in the field, and sometimes a writer will pitch a story and then they'll file the story and it's not the story they pitched. And I'm like, what happened? And they're like, oh, well, the people from that group wouldn't talk to me, so I talked to the other people instead. But I would rather know that sort of going through the process. I don't want to be handed a story to have to read through 1,000 words and then I go, wait a minute, this isn't what I was pitched. And maybe if you had contacted me from the field or before you started writing, we could have said, you know what, it's just not going to work out, or oh, I actually like this new angle. But to just kind of blindside an editor with a different type of story is not going to build your credibility for future pitches.
Yeah, if I've already committed to buying a piece from you, I really want you to over-communicate about what's happening with your story, and if something falls through that's really crucial, I don't want to find out about that on the back end. I'd also just say, to reinforce a point that was made earlier, the bar is really high if you've never worked for me before and you're gonna send me a pitch saying, I wanna go to X place and write about Y topic. You just really have to give me more than that. You have to give me a real sense of who your characters are, what the plot is, and how you're going to surprise me and surprise readers.
And also, sorry, go ahead.
As someone, who is speaking among the editors who might be taking his pitch someday, I've never faked it until I made it, ever. That's never been something I would do. I'd never, send in a pitch that I wasn't 100% sure would work and maybe didn't even know if it would work at all and still sent it in and then had to figure it out from the field. But if I had, that would be a big part of my job, actually. I mean, this is actually in reality what you do. You figure it out, and some stories, to me, like, you can just tell there's more there, and you probably won't be able to figure it out when, you know, I just got done doing this, in fact, with an outlet and just saying, like, look, trust me, once I get there, like, there's so much stuff that's going to open up. I just feel it. I can sense it. I can smell it. And the editor was like, all right, fine, go, you know. And you've got a bunch of different threads. You know, there's a bunch of pieces that could fall in. There's maybe this one won't, maybe this one will. But that pitch was, like, definitely less than 20%, you know, but I know there's something there. But on your first pitch, you can't do that. So ignore the second part I just said and pretend like always.
Hi there, it's me again. I'm Jared from Flagler College. This is slightly less of a serious question, but I just wanted to ask it because I figured maybe there's some interesting stories behind. But for any of you, do you have any particularly bizarre stories about really bad pitches or pitches gone wrong that you recall or that stick out to you, that so we know not to do that?
Well, when I get a pitch that says Slate Magazine would love this story, it's definitely going to win me over.
I pitched a story called the Popocatépetl, the most dangerous volcano in North America. And it got accepted by Scientific American. And I started reporting it, and I learned that Popocatépetl is not the most dangerous volcano in North America. Not even close. It blows up a lot, but it blows up in a very controlled way, and like it's very like predictable. And like even the Aztecs who lived there were like, oh, it's gonna blow. Let's all clear out. So it's actually not very dangerous. It makes a lot of noise, but it's not that dangerous. And anyone that know the most dangerous? Actually, Mount Rainier of all. Yeah, you got it. Mount Rainier. So that completely torpedoed my story. It made for a great blog post, a very funny blog post. They got picked up by Slate. But, but like you just pick yourself up and laugh and try to move on.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, I get pitched a lot. I mean, daily. And I can tell that it's being sent, it's so generic. You know that's the same pitch they're sending to every newsroom and every news organization. And it's just generic, and I just delete. And if, you know, most of the time, because I can tell that they are not speaking to me and to my newsroom and to what we do. It's just blanket and it's generic.
I will agree with that. Generic is bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I'm allergic to pitches that say the story is very important. Because important feels to me like a proxy for something else, and sort of a lazy proxy. It also feels scoldy. It feels like they're trying to guilt trip me into accepting a story. Yeah, it should be interesting. It should be just sort of irrepressible in the pitch itself. Important turns me off.
Yeah. Don't tell me why. Don't tell me your story is important. Just tell me the story. Show me Show me why it's important. You want the reader, in this case the editor, to go, oh, this is important. You don't want to be in the position of having to say that.
By the way, this is also important.
Also, if you pitch for television, because you may also want to do something for TV or a piece that is audiovisual. To do, now with iPhones you can do anything, so, or with smartphones, you can do anything. To do a small sizzle reel of something, especially if you are pitching something long, like a series of, or a mini documentary or a series of, in one topic, a sizzle reel of 30 seconds, that will go a long way.
In terms of like the text equivalent of a sizzle reel, a lot of people in their pitches, they'll send me, they'll have that sentence in there that's like, I've written for Slate and Scientific American and US News or whatever. I'm probably, if I've never, I'm getting a lot of pitches, if I've never met you before, I'm probably not going to click on all those links. So you might be better off in your sort of description of yourself saying, I broke this story, and describe what the story is. Tell me what you've done, and you can say, I broke this story for Slate or whatever, but instead of just linking to publications, that does give me a sense like, oh, other editors are buying your work. But I'd much rather have you say, and you know, you only really need one or two examples. But you know, if it's a story I've heard of before, or maybe I read and I didn't realize that you wrote it, that's going to make me a lot more interested in your pitch.
I just got a really outrageous pitch from a freelancer I'd actually worked with before saying, yeah, I want to go to this country in Africa, I won't name the country, and interview people who've gone through this terrible experience and so on and so on. And then she filed the story, and I said, okay, that sounds interesting. She filed the story, and she didn't make quotes from people. And I said, well, where are the people? And she said, oh, well, they wouldn't talk to me about it. So it was like, that's just ridiculous. And I would never work with that writer again, because you can't overpromise a story and then not deliver the people that you need to make the story work for an editor.
Okay, hi. Is this on? No.
Yes.
Yes, okay. My name is Julia Canny. I'm a 2016 graduate at the College of William & Mary. My question is about inclusivity in pitching. I think a lot of the topics are we want to pitch and we want to get our articles picked up, and something that I'm interested in is how you go about making sure that your sources and your writers are inclusive and that are telling stories that are from different perspectives. Women's Media Center released a report saying that women, despite being more than 50% of the population in the U.S., only write 1/3 of media in the U.S., and for women of color it's even less than that. So I guess my question is sort of how do you ensure through your taking pitches and things like that and also sourcing for stories that you're being inclusive in that space?
That's a great question. You know, I wish I had a great, I so appreciate the question. And I gotta tell you, when it comes down to it in a newsroom, you know, and I can't say that this is going to be true for everyone, but I'm so busy, we are all so busy, it's really the story, you know? It's gotta be tailored to the outlet. You know, if you want to pitch a story of, you know, a particular group of women of color in some particular part of the world, and you're pitching it to USA Today, it seems like it may not be the right place for it, you know? But maybe USA Today should take, no, I don't, I like to think that we have, there's no, in my experience, and I've been doing this for 21 years, and I know we are much more interested in thinking about the untold stories of people, but we don't think of it in terms of numbers. I don't. And I'm a woman of color, you know? And I've worked in a lot of newsrooms. I will say that NPR is one of the, if not the most inclusive, if you want to use that word, but that isn't the story we're having at our meetings. You know, how inclusive are we today? We don't do that. That's not real. I mean, you want to hope that the brand that you are pitching to is receptive to your story, you know? But, you know, we certainly wouldn't, I mean, I wouldn't want to hear someone say, hey, listen, you've only done 30% of, you know, stories about these type of people or this demographic, therefore you should take this pitch. The world doesn't work that way. Newsrooms certainly don't. It doesn't even really make sense in that particular way. We can't quantify in that. And this is from my perspective, right? You know, there are organizations that do keep track, and we have ombudsmen who do, but that isn't the reality, you know? It's just not. I don't stop and think, okay, I have literally edited 40 stories this week. What percentage deals with, you know, that's international versus, it's.
Yeah, I guess also, sorry, I also meant like by writers who are like women or people of color or people of
It's your story.
Sort of
you know what? I appreciate the question again. I think,
no,
yes, these are things that we're more, some newsrooms are going to be more open to it, are working and are actively thinking about it. Wait a minute, do we have a fair representation of voices? Who's telling these stories? Oh, do we have someone who's of this particular group or demographic or has an insight in, you know, do we want, yes, you know, you hope so, but like, again, it's the story first.
Yeah,
You're a
one
journalist first.
One thing I try to do is develop relationships with the writers in country, like to find someone from Bangladesh or from Malawi or from Nigeria who can write for us. And I gotta say, it's very, very hard. There are different standards of journalism in different parts of the world. Sometimes someone will write like a very decent pitch letter and they're a Nigerian journalist and the story they deliver is just not sort of American-style journalism with sources from both sides and with objective point of view throughout the story. The other thing that so that's just been a real struggle for us. It's like we really want to work with people who are local, and sometimes we'll stumble upon someone and it's just like a match made in heaven. Like I work with this writer in India now, and she's phenomenal. She knows how to write for an American outlet. She knows India, like, obviously she lives in India, she knows it very, very well. She knows all the nuances of a story. What we do try to do when we do a story in the field, sometimes off of a study, like there are often academics from American institutions, often who are white, who go into an international community and do a study on some issue of child rearing or neonatal death or whatever. And we don't want to just talk to the academics who parachuted in. We want to really get a voice of someone who lives in that country. And it takes a lot of work, but I remember we did a story on a program in Bangladesh to give money to seasonal workers so they could go in the city and work in the city during the off season, and they would make more money that way than any other kind of helping program that was in place. And our reporter on staff she was amazing. She found a guy, and it's like his voice gave that story such authority and such authenticity, because he lived in an area of Bangladesh where when agriculture is in season, he's able to make a living, and when it's not, he's not. And he could talk about the impact on his family, on his kids, on what he could feed them. So those kind of voices are just critical. And even if you can hook up with somebody by Skype, by WhatsApp, just to get that into a story takes it to another level and gives you that sort of feeling that it's authentic.
I would say diversity of writers is an issue we talk about a lot in the newsroom. It's a problem for us. I think it's a problem across the industry. And I think I think, yeah, I am looking for the best story. I often don't even notice the byline when I read a story or I'm reading a pitch. But I think when you have a diversity of writers, people, different people with different backgrounds write things differently. They perceive things differently and they write things differently. And it's healthy to have different people with different backgrounds writing for your site. I think part of the problem is that we're all constantly rushed, and there's something happens, and you want a story, and you're looking for a reporter or an opinion writer, and you know the person, and you know that person's dependable, and he is a person you have used for a long time, and so you reach for them. One of the sort of practical ways we've tried to get around that is for all of us to dump our Rolodexes into a file that we can all access, and to look and see, well, these are the people I always go to, but here's some different people, and this is their background, maybe they're different in one way or another, and it's usually a matter of time, but it doesn't change unless you're consciously trying to change it. I want to say one other thing, which is about the Bangladeshi writer. We struggle with this as well. When I get a story from Yemen, it would be great to have a Yemeni writer write about Yemen. I have found, both as a writer and a reporter, that the best people to write about countries or regions are the people who are the person who is simultaneously an insider and an outsider. Someone who knows the society really well, speaks the language, but someone who is removed enough from the society that they have perspective on their country, on their region, on their society. That's really hard to find. And so that's alongside the obstacles that you talked about, Mark. Those are some of the things that are a hindrance in trying to find good stories, good people to write good stories.
I would like to differ with everything you said because my situation is totally different. At VOA, we broadcast in more than 40 languages. The VOA building, the Cohen building, is like the United Nations. You find people from all over the world. It's a pleasure to work there. So you have a lot of voices and a lot of diversity, a lot of religions. You name it. We have Bangladesh, Yemen. We have it. So even when we broadcast and we do something in English, sometimes we ask them for advice because obviously our audience is international, so they will help us shape our story better. And even when we pitch travel in the English division, we always go to the language services. Or travel or big stories that that need resources, and we have to justify the resources. We will go to the language services and tell them, is this something your audience care about? And what is the angle that we should give to this story so someone in your country is going to read it? So we are always mindful of that, but obviously because our audience is totally different. So in our newsroom, we work differently, and I think. And also, I know the rush and everything, you have to polish, but we are trying even in the website, when we choose pictures, that we have diversity in our pictures, or when we search someone. So sometimes we are using the same sources because it's just the way we always done it. So I know that we are in a rush, but if we don't think about changing those habits, then that is never going to change. So we are trying. So why all the sources are white men? Aren't they, women that are, by instance, that are also very good in this topic, that are experts on this topic? So let's find also a women. So, and it's just, of course, you have to wait to spend some time, because you always go to the same people, and it's easier. You have to spend a little bit of time doing that. We are trying to do that, one with the pictures that we choose, with the sources that we have, with the experts that we interview. But also, again, we work in a very diverse environment in VOA.
Yeah, it's not just on the editor. You as writers have to be thinking about this. And I ran into this with archaeology stories in ancient Mesoamerican sites, where it's like, okay, I'm a white guy, I'm writing about this ancient civilization. I can't quote a bunch. I mean, no one should be quoting a bunch of British and American archaeologists who may have the most funding and be doing the most amazing work. But you have to think about how is this whole package you're putting together going to look, and what, and so it's also on you, and also, I mean, within cultural context, like, am I going to go to Mexico and do a story on the Maya and only quote some wealthy white Mexican from Mexico City? Like, that, he's Mexican, but it's like, anyone who's been there knows that, like, this is a very different situation. Like, how can you tell that story? And there are some times when you have no choice. Like, the story is this way, but you can. There are a lot of voices in your story who don't necessarily have to be the easiest white male that you came across. It could be a number of different people, and that's where you have to be creative. And to some extent, that's almost as important, like, because those are the voices. They're representing the story. You're just a byline. But those people are really telling the story, and sometimes there are voices that are getting ignored. So it's on, I think, everybody.
And editors pay attention to that.
Yeah.
We look for the voices. I look to see who are the voices. Could they have found someone else, Mm-hmm. Remember, a lot of your editors, especially the really experienced ones, know these topics well, and these subject areas well. And they will say, yeah, we know the British dude is, very well funded, but gosh, there are other people they could have gone to, because I'm familiar with this particular university and wherever that has, a particular.
I will say, I just wanted to make two quick sort of optimistic points. One is that there's some evidence that paying closer attention to diversity of sources, consciously doing that can train you to do it subconsciously. The BBC did a project in which they had reporters track sources for a while, and they found that it did dramatically improve the sort of balance of sources in those stories, even after they stopped tracking it, or stopped tracking it themselves. And then, I just make the point that, like, a lot of this has to do, or has to start with the way that newsrooms look, and that's something I think we're all working on. I myself, I've always worked for women, actually, and the newsroom I'm in now, I think, is one of the largest in the country to be run by a woman of color. And I definitely see firsthand that when you have a diversity of voices in top management, it does change the way that people think about stories and think about decision making.
Hi, I'm Kylie. I go to Wake Forest. I'm a senior. I think my question is probably a little more technical, but I imagine a lot of us have the same concern, is that when you're pitching, you're afraid it's going to get lost in, like, a deep, dark sea of emails. So do you have any advice on, like, now that we're beginners at this, getting your foot in the door, and maybe, like, instead of pitching directly to like the pitching part of the website? Should we try and find editors, like specifically, or is that annoying?
Yes and yes. In other words, so here's my advice. Yeah, in addition to, if there is a pitch email address, don't just send it there. Find the editor who is the editor for the thing that you want to write and pitch to them. Don't put more than one editor's name on your to list. There is the tragedy of the commons phenomenon, which is that I see that 5 other editors got this pitch. They're going to deal with it. I'm not going to look at it, and then we all do that. And you know, this is going to sound silly, but put something flashy in the subject line. You know, take the most interesting point you have in your pitch and either put it at the top of the email or put it in the subject line, or the most, you know, engaging aspect of you and what you're bringing to the story. It's childish, I know, to ask for it. But I'm telling you, it works. It is the way that I sort through emails. It's the thing that calls out to me that I look at. That's my advice.
I would also say, like, if you have any connections, just work on them. If I get a pitch from someone that says, oh, my journalism professor whom you used to work with suggested I contact you, that's going to just catch me more than a cold pitch. And the other thing, I might have said this earlier, but please don't ever pitch on a Friday or a weekend, because it's really going to get lost. I mean, at NPR in particular, Fridays are a crazy day in the digital world. And I might get a pitch at 10 o'clock Friday morning. I'm like, well, I'm going to get back to this one. And then it falls away. So, and as I said, it's okay to come back, to circle back, like not every day and not in an annoying way, but just to say, hi, I just wanted to remind you I sent you this pitch. Do you have a reaction? Just kind of keep it neutral and call back to my attention. And that works for sure.
Also keep in mind, like, you guys are journalists. Like, getting to people is what you do. So, like, this is how you separate the wheat from the chaff. Like, how can you make that connection? Like, that's kind of what we all do. That's really the only thing we offer is, like, look, you know, you can call a scientist to talk about this, or you can call me and I can get on the ground, talk to someone in real life, like, do the work. But it's the same thing for getting an editor, right? Like, figure out how you know this person. Figure out who you know who knows this person. I mean, the first time I wrote for the New York Times, I did a profile for, like, a local little magazine about David Perelman, who's this, like, legend in the science writing field. And I was writing about this guy, and one of the sources I used was this guy who wrote for the Times. So I called him and I was like, hey, used to be a student of his, used to work with him in this other little paper, like, give me a quote about, like, what a great guy he is. Great, thanks, perfect. And then I had a story for the Times, so I called the guy who I had interviewed, and I was like, hey, is there someone I can pitch there? Speaking of absolutely nothing, since you don't know me, except for this guy who called you. He's like, yeah, sure, you can pitch David. And I was like, all right. And so but that was kind of intentional. It's like, look, this is how you do it. And so you get creative. How would you approach a source?
Yeah, I think in this lesson, you know, I was a freelancer for a long time as well, and I think this lesson takes a long time to learn. It certainly took me a long time to learn. Maybe I'm a little slow, but people tend to like to be asked for things. It makes them feel wise and powerful, especially asked for advice. So if you really can't figure out a connection to someone, you can always try the cold email. You know, hey, I want to know more about how to, you know, pitch you, or, you know, can we get coffee sometime? Certainly there are people who I asked for that coming up, and I really learned a lot from those experiences, and I try to, and I think a lot of my colleagues try to sort of pass that on, you know, have that same willingness to make new connections with people. So don't be afraid to ask to make that connection. The worst thing that you can get is no, and you really shouldn't be in this business if you can't handle no, because it's just no all the time. It's rejection after rejection after rejection.
Yeah, I mean, I have a freelancer that I worked with for a number of years, and she had a friend. She said, hey, do you mind if my friend pitches to you? And I was like, no. So the friend sent me a pitch, and it's like, oh, I'm Sasha's friend, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it was just an easy way in, and it didn't. I didn't take her pitch in the end, but it was an easy way for sure. But I've done the same thing too as a freelancer. I recently found a story I wrote 30 years ago and I never sold it anywhere. I thought, I'm going to sell it. And I asked a friend, hey, I want to pitch it to this website. I don't know anybody there. Can you give me the editor's name? And she did. And I could say, oh, my friend Carrie said I could pitch to you. And it makes life a little easier if you can do that.
Hi, my name is Jackie Flynn. I'm from Texas Christian University. I did my project on the water conservation and the Cape Town water crisis. I was very nervous to pitch my story because that had been picked up by nearly every news network already. It was very exhaustively reported on. But my question is, when you have an angle or an aspect to a story, how do you pitch it so that it still catches the eye of the editor and it's not just like, oh, another story on the water crisis?
People, the characters, narrative. If you're telling a story at the top that has to do with people who are involved somehow in the water crisis, and only lower down you pull back and you say, and you give me the broad story. I probably know that broad story already because I've seen it. I've seen it on the news and I've read about it in the Times. I'm still hooked by the people if it's engaging enough. I think that's your best bet.
I'm a big fan of the counterintuitive thesis. When I worked at US News, that was our deal. And the media runs like a herd, and everybody does the same story over and over and over. But if you dig a little deeper, if you talk to 3 more sources, you can find that, well, in fact, that study that says that a cup of coffee a day will cure high blood pressure is really full of holes, and it's not all that. So if you can find sources that'll help you develop a counterintuitive or a surprising take on a topic, that's great for an editor to see.
Yeah, just remember the whole industry runs on surprise. So whatever the most surprising part of your story is, that's what you should put up top in your pitch.
Also, I would say another way to do it, with character is always the best, but if you put into context the story, like by instance, for me, if you put it into context that it's the same way that it is in this town in Africa, and you put a parallel, like something's happening in the United States, it's the same thing that is happening in other part of the world, and you do this connection, or put some different context to it. That is something different. That's another take of it. The same story. You are still telling the story, but in a different way.
And this is a little non sequitur, but it picks up on this point. Don't think that you have to pitch only to the big media outlets, There are ways that you can find, there might be a local connection to some town and some, in this country. If you can localize a story, pitch it to a local, news organization or a regional one or someplace that's niche, that just focus. There are so many industry papers. I mean, I find them in the most obscure way because I have aggregators that I follow that show me these places, and I'm like, oh, what a fascinating story. Oh, and it came from this local paper or local, outlet.
Wow, you're so much better at your job than I am.
I'm just obsessive compulsive. That's my problem.
Aggregators.
Hello. Hi. My name is Alexa Smith, and I'm from the City Colleges of Chicago. And I have a question for all of you. My question is, how would you suggest that a writer should write their pitch in a way where they can personalize it, but not write about themselves too much, have a balance between the facts and a connection? Like, for example, for me, I wrote about how Hurricane Maria has affected people with disabilities in Puerto Rico, and I wanted to cover that story because I have a physical disability. So in my pitch, I wrote something like, I want to cover this story because I wanted to know how these individuals can get around after a disaster, because I feel as though sometimes where I live it's hard for me to get around, and I feel like everyone should have equal accessibility. whether they're disabled or not.
So in that case, so first of all, that speaks to one of the questions that came up here. Why you? What's your expertise? What do you bring to the story? So that should definitely be part of the pitch. I want to know that. That sounds very compelling to me. If you are the story, you're at the top. You should be at the top of the pitch. If the story is people elsewhere who are dealing with this issue, but you have a certain insight, a particular insight, in my mind, you should be at the bottom of the pitch. Tell me the story, and then at the end say, and by the way, I know something about this issue because this is my background. These are my struggles. These are the issues that tie me to the story itself.
Yeah, I think the way you phrased your question was sort of the perfect pitch because you gave us the issue and then you gave us why it's an important issue from your perspective and what you would bring to it. And that would, as an editor, that would make a difference to me for sure hearing that.
In your case, that, I think that is the story. There's a lot of gray areas, and you should always remember that you are writing for the reader, and you're not writing for yourself. And you only put yourself in the story if it's going to help the reader understand it better. It's not to make yourself feel good because I went to this crazy thing and I want you guys to know how cool I am. There needs to be a reason why you're in there. And I write about myself a lot, but it's always really look, I gotta put myself back in here. It's the easiest way to get this idea across in a palatable way. I gotta be there. And I do it. I try to be really intentional because I don't want to just be and then I'm going to put me in there because I like to talk about myself like that, and a lot of writers do that. And so you really have to be intentional about, okay, I need to be the one telling this. In your case, though, I think that story, yeah, in the first line is look, this is what the story's about. It's about my experience and these other people's experience. But it's not always like that, and you have to feel it out.
Yeah, I'd sort of echo what people said about organizing the pitch. Whether if the story's about you, then put it at the top. If you have a special insight, put it in the bottom. I also think that applies to when you actually write the story. You can sort of lean into the first person at the beginning if the story's really about you. But if it's an added nuance, that tends to come in a kicker section or a fifth section. I'd also be really aware when you're pitching a story that involves first-person elements, how often that outlet that you're pitching to does that. Some outlets never do it or almost never do it. Some outlets, it's their bread and butter. And even the there are some outlets that love the story that's look at what a badass I am for going to this place. I'm thinking of a certain outlet. There's some outlets that's their bread and butter. So be really aware of whom you're pitching and how acceptable that first person element is going to be to them.
I think we're all thinking of that same outlet.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Christian Hernandez from American University. And I was wondering, at what point do we start talking about money? The price set per story, and what are some resources for young freelancers to figure out if this is a viable career for them and how to survive on it.
I think it's important for the editor and the writer to talk about money early on, because otherwise just sort of misunderstandings develop. In my situation, I have a limited budget. I can pay a certain amount of money for a story in a certain range, and sometimes the writer will be like, well, I get $1,000 a story, and I'm like, can't help you there. I mean, there are more outlets than ever, and I feel like pay is lower than ever for freelancers, so that's not an encouraging message to deliver, but I think that's the reality. I mean, our range of pay for a blog post is typically $200 to $500. So, for a story that would require one or two sources in the $200 range for a more ambitious piece, we can we really can't go much higher than 500 just because of our budget constraints. I used to work at National Geographic, where in its heyday they paid $3,000 for a caption set, not for the story, but for a writer who was assigned to write captions for the pictures. So that's like the pinnacle. I think that's been scaled way, way, way back since I left there a few years ago. But yeah, it's tough. It's really, really tough. And I know a lot of people that think, oh, I can do it as a freelancer. I have a friend who was actually laid off by National Geographic, and he's like, I'm going to do freelance editing and freelance writing. And now he's like, oh my God, I've got to get a job. Because the other thing, as a freelancer, you are just invoicing all your sources for your money and not getting paid, and you have to remind them. That's a whole other enterprise. It takes, unfortunately, way too much time because a lot of these systems are really hard to use. I freelance for the Post, and using their system is just like, it's a big pain in the butt, and you never know if you do it right, and it shouldn't be so hard, and yet it is.
And I'd say you have to push on this. And if someone says, we like your writing, we want to publish you, we don't want to pay you very much, that's not good enough. Like you will, this is something the industry's dealing with, and you have to push. You have to, if they're not going to pay you enough for your time, you're not, you're basically just bringing down the rates for everyone else, and you have to think about, like, are you going to is this going to be enough to make a living? And there's at the beginning of your career, you have to sort of, take some crap jobs, but you do have to push back, and you have to ask for more money, and some editors just won't give it to you, and it shows in the stuff that runs. Because if you can't pay enough for good work, and you have to think to yourself, do I really want to do a story where I'm not talking to enough people? Like, is that something I want my name on? Because I don't know if I got it right, because I didn't have enough time to figure out if I got it right. And am I going to find out that, like, 3 weeks from now I completely blew it? And these are tough calls, but you have to think about this. And sometimes you have to say, no, I'm sorry, that's just not enough. I say it all the time now, but it's a luxury I have. But I just you gotta be kidding me, no way. But you should be thinking that way too, as soon as possible. Like, this is a career, this is a business. You are running a business. And you gotta think that way.
You asked when and how to raise it with an editor. I think the when is after they respond to your pitch and say yes. And I think the how, really, I think an editor should, when they respond and say, I want that story, should say, so that it's not left to you, frankly. So that, should say what we pay for this story is $500, $1,000, whatever it is. When they don't, the phrase I developed was, somewhere in the email I would say, and now to the crass issue of money. How much do you pay for this story? And the second thing I would say is, I think, in the years that I was a freelancer, it always felt to me like I'm part writer, I'm part pitchman, which you described, and I'm part accountant. I'm part sort of like sending out invoices, keeping track of, who's paying me and who's not. It's a lot. It's complicated, but the accountant part is probably fully a third of your job, because if you're not doing it right, you're not going to make a living, and if you're not making a living at it, you're not going to last. It's really important. It can feel like this is not the art part. This is not the important part. I want to write. That's why I got into this business. It's really important. Don't neglect it.
You don't actually write that much in this business. You do the other stuff.
I would just say you should never feel bad about being a fierce advocate for your own career. No one else is going to do it for you. And I feel like a lot of people are like waiting for permission to do that, and so consider this permission. No one is going to feel bad about you asking to get paid, like that. And they're just not. I've never been angry when someone said, oh, and by the way, how much do you pay for this? This is what I want. This is how much it's going to cost me to do this. Just don't have anxiety about that. It's a totally normal part of this. The only other piece of advice I'd give you is, like, you should talk to each other about how much you get paid. You have a right to do that in this country and in most other countries. And that applies to whether you're on staff or a freelancer. That is going to be your leverage if you have information about how much your colleagues get paid and how much different outlets pay. You should, and I would say I think HuffPost pays very competitively, and I would encourage you to pitch us.
Also, you should ask editors what the range is, because we have ranges for level of expertise. So if you're someone who's, this is the first time, or we're just getting started in like building a relationship, and you're going to probably get the lower end of the range, but if you are an area expert, you'll get in the next level. So don't be afraid to ask, the range, and how do you determine what level I come in at and I should be paid at?
Also, the beauty of pitching an editor over time is that I would, if I buy your stories and use them, I would say, oh, this is the guy I would go to if I wanted a story about tuberculosis. And then I will call you or email you and say, hey, this study came out, we want a story on it, can you do it? And so then you develop a kind of a two-way relationship where it's not all incumbent on you to come up with these story ideas to pitch.
Hi there, I'm back again. Just had lots of questions. Just building off the money thing, I don't know if this is a good strategy or not, but I figured I'd ask. In freelancing, is it ever a bad idea to overshoot what you think you should be paid for an article and then expect that to be brought down, but then use that as a strategy, or is that just kind of like a bad idea from the get-go?
I mean, I'm always willing to negotiate. If I assign a piece to a writer and say I can pay you $200, and then the writer says, well, really, for the amount of work and reporting and time involved, I would like to ask for another amount. That's okay, but it has to be within the within the realm of the reasonable.
Don't ask for $30,000.
Yeah, kind of.
So start with asking what the range is. Start so that you don't put yourself in a position where you seem like you're completely out of touch with what the market rate is.
Yeah, if you haven't worked in this before, like, you need to be within the realm of reality. But at the same time, like saying I want to double that, like $200, like that's not. I mean, that's completely.
But you know what? If I work with the writer over the years, we'll kind of bump them up level-wise, because it's like if I know I can count on you every time you pitch something or I assign something to you, that's value to me, and it means I don't have to spend many hours editing and going back and forth with the story, so that's all factored in too.
Yeah.
It also depends on the news organization. I mean, there are some that I will agree with you. There is a range. I mean, we cannot go over. I mean, it's just that we can't. So if we have a range, probably we don't have that much room to negotiate, especially as me that work, that I have a budget and all that, and that is from taxpayers' money. I have to be very careful with that. I don't have that much room of negotiation. Everything is very transparent. So it depends on the news organization, really. But I would say that mostly they have a range. And
these aren't used cars.
With that.
Yeah, these aren't used cars. This is not. I think most people here probably were straight shooters. You say what you can pay. We say what we want. It does. This is not real estate.
No.
I wouldn't think you'd get a lot of trust if you were trying to manipulate.
I would just say I can't think of a time that someone's sent me a number that I thought was so outrageous that I just stopped considering buying the story. I don't think that's ever happened to me. And even if they did, my response would be, I can't go over X. If it doesn't work out, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and you have to scale it. Like I've worked with writers who work for the New Yorker, and I'm sure the New Yorker pays a lot more than we do. And that writer said to me, when I write for online publications such as yours, I charge 50 cents a word. It's like, we can make that work. So it's okay to, you should definitely advocate for yourself. But again, like I said, keep in mind what the range of the publication is. You can take the same material and repurpose, not redo the same story over and over, but a lot of times you'll gather in more reporting than you were using for that first story, so you can then try and figure out a way to use that additional material in another story from another outlet. And with NPR, we give you the rights back to your story after a week, so you can resell this if you do.
Hi, my name is AJ Nadaf. I'm from Davidson College, and my question is about multimedia journalism and about pitching. Do you value more? Are you more likely to accept a pitch that also, where the pitcher can also photograph or include a video? And also, do you recommend that we should we be versatile as journalists and try and hone multiple skills, or just focus in on the craft of writing, really, you know? I'm wondering about the evolution of multimedia journalism.
So we have a fellows program where we take people for 1 year who are not straight out of college. Often they have a little bit of journalism experience, or they've been abroad. You know, as foreign policy, we tend to attract people who have, you know, gone off and been in China for 4 years and come back and speak, you know, the language really well, or things like that. Yeah, the issue of multimedia and skilled in a range of things is there's never a downside to it. So we have a podcast, most places do now. We do a little bit of video, most places do now. And when we're interviewing fellows, and mostly these are editing and writing jobs, but if they say, yeah, I know Adobe Audition, I can cut tape, I can, you know, shoot video, bonus. There's no downside to it.
Yeah,
Let's
and
tell you
also
a picture. I mean, basically, we can't promote a story without a photograph. So if it's a story that there are pictures on the wires about, that's fine. But if you're going to a remote village somewhere or interviewing somebody in a place that's difficult to access for photography, and you can take decent pictures and you understand how to frame a picture, and we can tell you, we always want horizontals because that's our format. That's a real selling point for any pitch.
Yeah,
sure.
and also there are sites for freelancers where obviously the pay varies. If it is just a written story, it's that much money. If you provide pictures, it's that much money. If you provide video, it's much more money. So the more you do, the more you provide, you know, the more your story is going to be worth. We are going to pay more for that story.
There's some writers who take such terrible pictures, and we're like, but their stories are great, so we don't mind. But we.
I mean, I think we have time for one final question.
I just want to comment. That's a legit point. I actually disagree with all of that because I think at a certain level, you can't shoot a story and write a story as well as you need to for that level. And I'm all about partnerships. I think you find talented people and work with them. And there's a certain point at which you're just not going to be able to do both those things at that level, and it's much more efficient to find someone who's good, someone you work with, and both of your journalism gets better when you work together.
Just wait 1 second. This is the last question, so I ask that your answer be short.
The question will be short too. Jonathan Custodian from LaGuardia Community College. Since this kind of reminds me of writing a cover letter, and since there's so much tailoring involved, do you have a max number of pitches, of outlets that you pitch to? That's more for Erik.
It depends on the story. I have this story that involved a lot of travel. It was a very involved story, and it's a pretty big piece that I wanted to do, and there's a limited number of places I can do that. And I think I've run through all of them, and it just so happens that the animal that is the center of the story is also being written about in 3 other big magazines. So it's like, oh! And so I think that story's probably dead. And that was probably 6 or 7 outlets that I was pitching. But there's a lot of stories that I could just keep going because it's a little more generalizable. It's a story that could work in a lot of different places. I don't have to travel as much. You know, I think after that many outlets, though, you got to start wondering why no one's taking it. You get to 10 outlets, and they all said no. I think you're past the point at which you should have been seriously questioning whether or not you have a good story. I have, on the other hand, though, I've had some stories that I just really believed in, and I kept pushing them. I had one story that everyone said, this is great, someone should do this. We're not going to. I was just like, okay, because it was sort of we should do this, not we want to do this. And I just kept pushing it, but it depends on the story. And it did run eventually.
Someone needs to ask Mark what Goats and Soda is.
Oh, yeah.
We wanted our name to be not overly earnest or depressing. I think The Guardian has a blog on development called Poverty Matters. Like, nobody's going to click on that. So we're just trying to come up with ideas that combine things. And one of our correspondents from Africa said everywhere he went, he saw goats, he saw soda. And goats are actually a way that people can generate income in poor countries, and soda can do what medicine aspires to do. They can get their Coke to any outpost in the most remote place and keep it cold, which is critical for medications. So there's actually even a website called Cola Life, I think, that talks about that. So we joined those two things together, and we periodically get a letter from someone saying, what a stupid name. But it worked, and it kind of conveys what we want to convey, that we're not afraid to have fun. We tell a lot of sad and serious stories. We started the blog when Ebola was first breaking out in West Africa, but no one said, oh my God, you can't call the blog that and write about Ebola. So we did it.
Thank you. I just want to say on behalf of the audience that this was a wonderful panel, and I hope that you'll stick around for lunch and that you can talk to Ebola a little bit more. Thanks.